Epilogue. Will and Holt sat facing each other, on either side of the plain wooden table in Holt's cabin on the edge of the woods. For the 5th time in the past few minutes, Will glanced down to make sure his uniform was clean and neat, the leather of his belt and double scabbard waxed and shining. As unobtrusively as he could, he reached up and smoothed his hair. Then he checked his fingernails, making sure that in the 40 seconds since he last checked them, they hadn't somehow become encrusted with dirt and grease. "It's not a fashion parade," Holt said. He seemed totally at ease. But then, Holt always seemed at ease. Will, on the other hand, was nervous as a cat. There was one thing he was grateful for, and that was that he didn't have to wear the new formal uniform that Crowley had devised for Holt's wedding. Tradition said that apprentices wore their normal everyday uniform for graduation day. Will doubted that he could have kept the white silk shirt and the fine leather tunic clean on such a day. By now, he would surely have spilled something on himself. "Wonder what's keeping Crowley," Holt said idly. And, as if on cue, they heard footsteps on the small veranda at the front of the cabin. The door opened suddenly, and Crowley bustled in, head down, a leather folder tucked under his arm. Right. Sorry to keep you waiting. Got held up on the way, but here I am at last, eh?" At the sudden appearance of the Corps Commandant, Will had jerked up out of his seat to stand to attention. Now he wondered why, since he had never before felt it necessary to do so in Crowley's presence. Crowley looked at him, a little puzzled, and motioned him back into his seat. "Sit down, Will. There's a good fellow. We don't stand on ceremony too much, you know." "Yes, sir," said Will. Holt raised an eyebrow to Crowley. "He's never called me sir," he said. Crowley shrugged. "Probably trying to get on my good side. Make sure I don't change my mind and have him study for another year before graduation." Holt nodded sagely. That could be it. Will glanced from one to the other, nervously wetting his lips. He wasn't sure what he'd expected of graduation day. He had assumed there would be more of a ceremony, more of a sense of occasion. But then, as Crowley had said, they were Rangers. Maybe graduation day was like any other day, except you graduated. Crowley pulled another chair to the table and sat, spilling papers out of the leather folder, taking out a quill pen and a sealed inkwell. He uncorked the ink and began flicking through the pages, muttering to himself as he read the official forms. "Right, let's get on with it. All right, you, Will, have trained as apprentice to Ranger Holt of Redmont Fife these last 5 12-months and blah, 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 and so on and so on. You've shown the necessary level of proficiency in the use of the weapons a ranger uses, the longbow, the sax knife, the throwing knife." He paused and glanced up at Holt. "He has shown that proficiency, hasn't he?" "Of course he has," he went on, before Holt could answer. "Furthermore, you are a trusted officer in the service of the king, and so on, and hi diddly diddly dee." He glanced up again. "These forms really carry on a bit, don't they? But I have to make a pretense of reading them. And so forth and so on and such like." He paused, nodded several times, then continued. "So, basically," he flicked a few more pages, found the one he was after, and then continued. "You are in all ways ready to assume the position and authority of a fully operational ranger in the kingdom of Araluen, correct?" He glanced up again, his eyebrows raised. Will realized he was waiting for an answer. "Correct," he said hastily. Then, in case that wasn't enough, he added, "Yes, I am, yes." "Well, good for you. So, one other detail. You know, we need to give you more of a title than Ranger Will, because there are 3 other Wills in the Corps. It's not a problem that applies to Holt, of course, because there's only one Holt. Normally, we'd use your family name, but you were an orphan. So, in your case, we looked for a name that reflected your achievements over the past 5 years. We looked at Will Borekiller. He made a mew of distaste. Didn't like that. Someone suggested Will of the Bridge to commemorate the destruction of Morgrass Bridge. But it sounded too much like Will of the Wisp, so we let that one go as well. Finally, your mentor, he nodded to Holt, suggested a name that had to do with one of your most meaningful contributions to the kingdom. He pointed out that you were one of those instrumental in the creation of the treaty between Araluen and Scandia, a very important milestone in our country's history. So the suggestion is that you be known from now on as Will Treaty. How does that suit? Will nodded slowly. I like that very much. Thank you, Crowley, sir, he amended, feeling the occasion required formality. Excellent! So, Will Treaty you shall be. Crowley wrote the name at the bottom of a form and swung it round to face Will, handing him the quill pen. Just sign there at the bottom, and we're done. He watched as Will scratched his signature at the bottom of the parchment form, then slapped his hands on the tabletop in satisfaction. There, all done. Congratulations, Will. You're a ranger now. Well done. Is there anything to drink? He addressed the last part to Holt. Will sat stunned. That was it? He didn't know what he'd expected, but he certainly hadn't expected this breezy, off-the-cuff, sign here and you're a ranger approach. Is that all? He blurted out. Crowley and Holt exchanged slightly puzzled glances. Then Crowley pursed his lips thoughtfully. It seems to be. Listed your training, mentioned a few achievements, made sure you know which end of the arrow is the sharp part, decided on your new name. I think that's... Then it seemed that understanding dawned on him, and his eyes opened wide. Of course! You have to have your silver what's-its, don't you? He took hold of the chain that held his own silver oak leaf around his throat and shook it lightly. It was the badge of a fully fledged ranger. Then he began to search through his pockets, frowning. Had it here. Where the devil is it? Wait, I heard something fall on the boards as I came in. Must have dropped it. Check outside the front door, will you, Will? Too stunned to talk, Will rose and went to the door. As he set his hand on the latch, he looked back at the two rangers, still seated at the table. Crowley made a small shooing motion with the back of his hand, urging him to go outside. Will was still looking back at them when he opened the door and stepped through onto the veranda. Congratulations! A massive cry went up from at least 40 throats. He swung round in shock to find all his friends gathered in the clearing outside, around a table laid for a feast, their faces beaming with smiles. Baron Harold, Sir Rodney, Lady Pauline, and Master Chubb were all there. So were Jenny and George, his former wardmates. There were a dozen others in the ranger uniform, men he had met and worked with over the past 5 years. And wonder of wonders, there were Erak and Svengel, bellowing his name and waving their huge axes overhead in his praise. Close by them stood Horace and Gillen, both brandishing their swords overhead as well. It looked like a dangerous section of the crowd to be in, Will thought. After the first concerted shout, people began cheering and calling his name, laughing and waving to him. Holt and Crowley joined him on the veranda. The commandant was doubled over with laughter. If you could have seen yourself, he wheezed. Your face! It was priceless. Is that all? He mimicked Will's plaintive tones and doubled over again. Will turned to Holt accusingly. His teacher grinned at him. Your face was a study, he said. Do you do that to all apprentices? Will asked. Holt nodded vigorously. Every one. Stops them getting a swelled head at the last minute. You have to swear never to let an apprentice in on the secret. He touched Will's sleeve and pointed. But only the luckiest or the best get this. Will looked in the direction he indicated and felt a lump rise to his throat. Side by side, Alice and Evelyn were walking slowly across the clearing towards him, carrying a small red satin cushion between them. Alice, tall, poised, ash blonde, and beautiful in her elegant courier's robe. Evelyn, tomboyish, grinning, honey blonde, and beautiful in her own way. And on the cushion between them, gleaming in the errant rays of the late afternoon sun that found its way through the trees, lay a simple silver oak leaf amulet on a chain, symbol of everything Will had been striving for in the past 5 years, now his. The two girls lifted it from the cushion and together draped it over his bowed head while the assembled crowd cheered themselves hoarse. Then, driven by the same impulse, they kissed him, Alice on the left cheek, Evelyn on the right. And then glared daggers at each other. "Let's get this party started," said Crowley hurriedly. And, catching Will by the arm, he drew him down to the group of friends waiting to congratulate him. It was a party that would go down in the annals of Castle Redmont. The last guests were still celebrating as the sun began to rise. Will and Horace, his oldest friend, sat on the little veranda watching the last dancers stagger out of the clearing and head for home. "Do you feel like a ranger at last?" Horace asked him. Will shook his head ruefully. "I feel absolutely overwhelmed by the whole thing," he said. Then, after a few seconds, he confided, "You know, a few weeks back, I didn't think I was ready for this." "And now?" Horace prompted. "Now I know that if you wait till you think you are ready, you'll wait all your life." The young knight nodded. "I couldn't have put it better," he said. "That's exactly how I felt when we came back from Scandia and Duncan knighted me. 'I'm not ready,' I kept wanting to say." "But you were," Will said. Horace nodded. "Yes, maybe our teachers do know what they're doing after all. Holt thinks the world of you, you know. When we were in prison in Marshavar, he knew you'd turn up to get us out. He must have been proud to see you graduate today, following in his footsteps." "They're big footsteps to follow in," Will said. "I guess that's why I thought I wasn't ready. I knew I'd never be as wise or as capable or as courageous as Holt. I could never be like him. Crowley said it today. There's only one Holt." Horace looked at him very seriously, appraising him, thinking of all he had learned about this remarkable young man in the past 5 years. "You may not ever be exactly like him," he said, "but there won't be a lot in it." Then the two friends leaned back and watched the sun rise clear of the trees. "Best time of day," said Will. "Yeah," Horace agreed. "What's for breakfast?" You have been listening to Ranger's Apprentice, Book 7, Erak's Ransom by John Flanagan, read by Australian Audiobooks. If you enjoyed listening, make sure you like and subscribe and check out the other books in this series. Happy reading!